For a lot of people in U.S. evangelical churches, the idea of a short-term mission trip, often called STM, is something they're probably quite familiar with.
Yeah, definitely.
It usually involves Christians from North America heading off to other countries, often places considered developing nations.
Right.
And because you've chosen to listen to the deep dive, you're likely someone who wants to really get to grips with a topic quickly and thoroughly.
Absolutely. And that's exactly our goal today. We're diving into the often complex world of these short-term mission trips.
Yeah.
Instead of just slapping a label on them, good or bad, we want to really unpack the cultural forces at play and explore their potential for, meaningful impact, drawing on some pretty fascinating research.
And we'll be looking at it from different angles.
Exactly. Insights from missiologists, people who study Christian missions academically, but also from practitioners, the folks organizing these trips, and importantly, leaders from the countries actually receiving these teams.
Great. Because, yeah, you, our listener, probably get that most big issues have layers. And STM definitely sounds like one of those.
It really is.
So let's maybe jump right into that central question. Are these short-term mission trips, actually a good thing?
It's a crucial place to begin, and what's interesting, or maybe surprising, is that this conversation isn't new at all.
Oh, really?
Yeah, from the very start of let's call it the contemporary STM phenomenon, there were voices, within missiology and among practitioners who found it problematic.
Right back then.
Absolutely. Some were arguing, way back in 2003, for instance, that STM, especially for young people, should probably just be stopped altogether.
Wow. Okay. That's a pretty definitive stance.
Yeah.
But I get the sense that's not the dominant view now.
That's right. The more prevailing view among Western Christian leaders, especially since around 2000, has shifted. It's more about reforming STM, finding ways to make it better rather than rejecting it outright.
Okay, so reform, not rejection. If that's the case, what are some of the main criticisms that reformers are trying to address? What are the big concerns?
Well, one really insightful critique draws a parallel between tourism and something much heavier, like imperialism.
Imperialism. How so?
Well, back in 1989, a scholar, Denison Nash, looked at tourism. He suggested it often stems from the productivity and, leisure time of wealthier metropolitan centers.
Okay.
And this leads to an economic and social dynamic where the touristic areas can get shaped, sometimes unintentionally, by the needs and desires of those centers.
I think I see the connection. The worry is that the travelers' perspectives coming from wealthier nations might sort of overshadow the local reality and autonomy.
Precisely. And that connects directly to criticisms of STM. Some researchers argue that travelers might project their own understandings onto the communities they visit,
leading to potentially skewed views.
Yeah, maybe you're romanticized or just plain inaccurate impressions of things like poverty or local faith. Others take a stronger line, arguing these trips can actually reinforce existing power inequalities.
And stereotypes, too, I imagine.
Exactly. Perpetuate negative stereotypes, foster illusions that aren't grounded in reality.
That sounds, quite problematic. Are there examples of how this kind of thing plays out?
Well, there are some quite pointed satirical pieces that sort of poke fun at these dynamics within evangelical circles.
Like what?
One piece mocked a suburban youth group going to the inner city and basically just coming back with all their negative ideas confirmed, vowing never to return except maybe to scare their own kids straight later.
Ouch.
Another satire had an STM team returning from Guatemala, suddenly judging their home church super harshly backslidden, fat, and lazy while completely idealizing the faith they saw abroad.
Right. Obviously exaggerated, but hitting on a real nerve about maybe superficial engagement and judgment.
Exactly. They highlight the potential for misinterpretation, for snap judgments, for these really distorted perspectives.
And this isn't just anecdotal stuff, right? There's actual research looking into the claimed benefits of STM.
Yes, absolutely. Empirical studies have started questioning some of the main claims.
Such as?
Well, things like whether STM actually leads to stronger support for long-term missions or boosts giving to development work, or even if it reduces ethnocentrism, judging others by your own culture standards.
And what's the verdict from that research?
It's interesting when researchers look beyond just self-reporting what participants say happened, the evidence for those positive outcomes often falls a bit short.
So, okay, lots of critical analysis happening. But you said earlier the general direction isn't total abandonment.
That's right. The overall sense from the research we're looking at is that, yeah, STM can be done poorly, definitely, but getting rid of it entirely isn't seen as realistic or maybe even desirable.
Why not desirable?
Because the potential for genuine cross-cultural learning, for interaction between Christians globally, that's seen as valuable, a resource that could be really positive.
So the focus shifts to how to do it well.
Exactly. How to make it more effective, less problematic. Which leads us right into the whole discussion about reform.
Okay, let's talk reform then. If the goal is improvement, what are the main ideas being put forward?
Well, there's pretty broad agreement among reformers that better preparation is key. Absolutely essential.
Preparation for the travelers.
Yes, the thinking is if you properly equip people before they go, you can significantly reduce those negative outcomes and cultural misunderstandings.
What makes sense? What does that proper preparation look like in practice?
Early on, you had groups like the Fellowship of Short-Term Mission Leaders, FSTML, developing things like standards of excellence.
Okay.
These focused on core principles, being God-centered, aiming for empowering partnerships, having appropriate training, and making sure there's thorough follow-up afterwards.
So setting some benchmarks.
Right. And there was this analogy that got used, comparing unprepared STM travelers to dogs in an art museum.
Dogs in an art museum.
Yeah, the idea being they see everything and understand nothing. It really drove home the need for context, for understanding.
That's a vivid image.
It is, though interestingly, it was later tweaked a bit to say, well, maybe children can learn in an art museum if they have the right guidance.
Ah, so implying that with the right framework, STM could be a genuine learning experience.
Exactly. It highlights that difference between just being physically present and actually engaging meaningfully.
Which requires some specific skills, presumably.
Absolutely. And thinkers like David Livermore really brought this idea of cultural intelligence to the forefront.
Cultural intelligence, what does that involve?
Basically, it's the capability to relate and work effectively across cultures, understanding different norms, values, communication styles, all that stuff.
Okay, so training people in cultural intelligence seems like a logical step for reform.
It does, but it's not universally seen as the complete answer.
Ah, okay. There's a but.
There is. Some researchers, like Naomi Hames, looking at this, ask whether better training alone is really enough to shift the fundamental cultural dynamics of STM.
What's her concern?
She worries that the existing structures, the way these trips are typically set up, might actually limit how effective even the best training can be. She even quotes an African church leader who said some preparation can actually be dangerous.
Dangerous. How so?
The implication seems to be that a little bit of knowledge without a really deep understanding or maybe the right humility could potentially do more harm than good.
That's a sobering perspective.
Yeah.
It suggests the problems run deeper than just individual traveler ignorance.
Exactly. Which leads to this argument that STM isn't just another form of travel or even traditional mission work. It's its own unique cultural practice.
A cultural practice.
Yeah. And if you want to reform a cultural practice, you need more than just individual training. You need to think about cultural change.
Okay, let's unpack that. STM as a cultural practice requiring cultural change. What does that actually mean here?
It means that really changing STM involves more than just tweaking how individuals think or the words we use. It means looking at the underlying structures.
Like
the power dynamics involved, the social networks, the institutional frameworks that shape these trips. Everyone involved usually wants the trip to be meaningful.
Right. Meaningful often translates to things like increased passion, more giving back home.
Often, yes. Increased passion for mission, maybe more financial giving, becoming a better Christian. But the deeper question is, how do these trips move beyond just reinforcing those individualistic narratives? How do they foster real, lasting connections and maybe more genuinely transformative experiences?
And this is where understanding cultural change comes in.
Precisely. Sociologists like James Davison Hunter have studied this, how broad cultural change actually happens. He's critiqued some common assumptions, such as the idea that just changing enough individual worldviews will do the trick, or that market forces alone can shift culture. He argues these views tend to underestimate the huge role of history, institutions, and, crucially, power structures.
So his point is that individual change doesn't automatically scale up to cultural change.
That's the core of it, yeah. Simply changing someone's beliefs or attitudes on a 10-day trip, for example, doesn't necessarily translate into a shift in the larger cultural patterns or institutions surrounding STM.
Which helps explain why focusing solely on training individual travelers might have limited impact on the overall system.
Exactly. It bumps up against what Haynes was suggesting, that focusing only on individual commitments can end up just perpetuating the perspectives and assumptions of the wealthier sending cultures.
Yeah, this is painting a picture of a really tangled issue. It's systemic, not just individual. So if better training alone isn't the silver bullet, what kind of structural changes are people talking about?
Well, many reformers are saying we need to rethink the basic architecture of STM trips. You know, the typical three-part structure.
Yeah.
Pre-trip, the trip itself, post-trip.
Yeah.
While lots of educational reforms focus on making each stage better, more prep, better reflection, etc., some suggest more radical shifts to the structure itself might be needed.
Radical how? Disrupting that typical flow?
Potentially. Or fundamentally changing the relationships within it. Consider a case study from London, an event called Soul in the City.
Okay.
Even though it was ministry-focused, the researchers found that the dominant cultural scripts of tourism really shaped how participants experienced it.
Even in a ministry context?
Yeah, and the study suggested that positive outcomes only really started happening when local urban congregations actively pushed back, reframing and reshaping the event to fit their context and ongoing work.
That's fascinating. But it also highlights a challenge, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, that kind of pushback and negotiation seems much harder in typical international STM situations, where there's often that big imbalance in power and wealth between the North American senders and the local hosts.
Absolutely. That imbalance is a huge factor, which has led to some really provocative suggestions.
Like what?
Like intentionally trying to subvert those wealth inequalities within the STM encounter itself.
How would you even do that?
Well, Bishop David Zaknirinji from Uganda offered a really powerful, simple idea. Just bring greetings.
Just bring greetings, meaning
Meaning, maybe the primary goal shouldn't be to do something specific, but simply to be present, to connect with the local community without a predetermined agenda. Just show up and build relationship.
wow, that feels radically different from the usual mission trip idea of going to build a house or run a program.
It absolutely does, and that's precisely why it challenges the traditional mission narrative so much.
It reframes the whole purpose.
Exactly. Along similar lines, Oscar Muriu, a pastor in Kenya, suggests maybe we should stop calling them short-term missions and instead call them short-term learning opportunities.
Shifting the emphasis from doing to learning.
Right. De-emphasizing the preset agenda, prioritizing learning, prioritizing reciprocal relationships. He has this great critique of what he calls helicopter missions.
Of the copter missions.
Yeah, you know, fly in, do something quick and visible, fly out with maybe very little lasting impact or real engagement. Craig Stephen Smith uses the term plight-based ministry, pointing out how focusing only on needs can accidentally reinforce negative stereotypes, even with good intentions.
So the push is towards being with people, learning from them, rather than just doing things for them.
That seems to be a major thread in the reform conversation. And this is crucial for that shift to be truly meaningful. It can't just be about changing the name or having better individual attitude.
It needs structural change.
Yes. It requires tackling those fundamental institutional arrangements. The fact that North Americans usually initiate the trips, control the funding, define the purpose and activities.
Are there churches or groups trying to change that, trying to shift the power?
There are. Some congregations are developing genuinely long-term relationships, maybe exchange programs, trying to move towards more equal partnership.
And are voices from the receiving end calling for this too?
Absolutely. There are strong calls from, for example, Latin American pastors and theologians pushing for real partnership, real collaboration, a fundamental reorganization of power in these relationships.
What does that look like from their perspective?
They want to be equals at the table, setting the agenda together. One pastor, Eitzen, talked about wanting groups to simply live with us, get to know us, have fellowship together, learn from one another, and teach one another. Another, Saron, basically said Latin Americans need to be able to say stop, if needed, and insist on co-creating the plan.
It sounds like a deep desire for mutuality, for relationships between equals.
Exactly. Miguel Ángel Palomino even argues against using the word mission for these trips, not on theological grounds, but because he feels the term itself gets in the way of that mutuality.
How so?
He asks these challenging questions like, would U.S. churches readily welcome short-term missionaries from Latin America who didn't speak English and came with their own agenda?
That's a good question. It flips the script.
It really does. There was this anecdote from a church board meeting, apparently, where the idea of Costa Rican students wanting to come do ministry in Wheaton caused some initial awkwardness. It revealed a kind of blind spot, maybe not fully recognizing the reciprocal desire to serve and contribute.
Yeah, that really illustrates the point about assumptions getting in the way. Now, what about the common practice of STM teams working with long-term missionaries already on the ground? How does that fit in?
Right, that's a very common model, and it has clear benefits, right? The long-term folks have local knowledge, language skills, ongoing relationships. They can help deploy the short-term team and resources more strategically.
Makes sense. But is there a downside?
There can be. The potential downside is that it can further mediate the whole encounter through essentially North American perspectives and narratives. It might actually limit direct interaction between the STM team and local leaders or the broader community.
So the long-termer, even unintentionally, acts as a kind of filter.
Sort of.
Yep.
Think about tourism studies that they talk about tourist culture and local intermediaries or tourates who kind of stage manageable, comfortable experiences for visitors.
Okay.
There's a potential parallel. Long-term missionaries focused on making the short-term trip smooth and productive from their perspective might inadvertently shape the experience in ways that align more with North American expectations than local realities.
Can you give an example?
One account described a trip to the Dominican Republic where the team's understanding of poverty and the local situation was heavily framed by the North American missionaries they were embedded with.
Right.
Even a visit to a local farmer's house, which was meant to be an authentic encounter, felt somewhat prearranged, almost like a photo op stop on a tour.
So the very structure designed to help could actually limit deeper, more direct connection.
It could. It can limit the development of what sociologists call linking social capital, those crucial connections between the visiting group and local leaders or networks outside the immediate missionary circle.
And why is that linking capital so important?
Because that's often where new ideas, different perspectives, and genuine collaboration can emerge. If the primary links are just back to other North Americans, the missionaries, it restricts the flow of influence and input from local voices who could reshape the STM experience.
So the argument would be that more direct links, maybe facilitated by bicultural people, are better for fostering that mutuality.
That's what some research suggests, yes. Direct connections between, say, a U.S. church and a local church overseas seem potentially more effective for building genuine partnership than always going through an intermediary expatriate missionary.
Okay. This all seems to be pushing towards a fundamental rethink of the entire purpose of STM.
I think that's fair to say. What is the core purpose? And the argument emerges that maybe it should be grounded much more deeply in the Missio Dei.
The Missio Dei, the mission of God. How does that change things?
Well, theologians like Kevin Van Hooser see the Missio Dei not just as one aspect of theology, but as central to all of it. God's fundamental nature is seen as sending, reaching out, for the purpose of creating communion and community.
So it's much broader than just specific mission activities.
Much broader. If you view STM through that lens, it helps dissolve some of those false divides we set up, like education versus mission, or listening versus doing, or even personal enjoyment versus service.
House.
If God's mission is about the reconciliation and reunification of all things in Christ, then potentially all aspects of an STM trip, learning the language, sharing meals, understanding the history, cultural activities, not just the work project, can be seen as sacred encounters within God's ongoing mission.
That's a much more holistic view. It integrates everything.
Exactly. It echoes theologians like David Bosch, who argued the missionary task really encompasses the entirety of human life. You can't separate the spiritual from the material and the social.
Which puts a lot of weight back on that preparation stage, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Framing the whole thing correctly.
Huge weight. How the cultural context is presented, what the guiding narrative of the trip is, that becomes absolutely crucial.
But you mentioned earlier, even well-meaning preparation might reproduce certain biases.
Yes, especially if it's primarily led by lay people from the sending culture. It can inadvertently reinforce culturally specific assumptions or narratives without critical reflection. That's why resources that really push on embodied faith and, importantly, radical structural changes are highlighted as valuable.
Can you give an example of a radical structural change suggestion from those resources?
Yeah, Joanne Van Engen offers some very concrete ones. For instance, she suggests STM teams should commit to spending at least as much money supporting local projects and initiatives as they spend on their own trip. Costs airfare, food, etc.
Wow, a 1-to-1 ratio.
Exactly. And directing those funds to locally based organizations, the focus shifts dramatically towards investment in ongoing locally led work.
What else does she suggest?
Prioritizing listening, really listening to local leaders and development workers. And crucially, avoiding doing work that local unemployed people could be paid to do.
That seems obvious when you say it, but probably happens all the time.
It likely does. She has this powerful quote: "Third world people do not need more rich Christians coming to paint their church and make them feel inadequate. They do need more humble people willing to come share their lives."
That really cuts to the heart of it, doesn't it? The potential for unintended harm, even with good intentions.
It really does. And look, pretty much everyone involved in STM would agree on the idea of humility, of sharing life. But the argument we're seeing in the research is that agreement isn't enough.
It needs the structural and narrative change to back it up.
Precisely. Lasting transformation for everyone involved seems most likely when the agendas of STM are consciously reoriented around that bigger picture, the Missio Dei, making education and genuine community primary goals. And, critically, relocating control.
Relocating control of the trip itinerary, the agenda.
Yes, to local Christian leadership.
So that really brings us back to the core challenge, doesn't it?
Which is,
are North Americans, churches, organizations actually willing to risk giving up that control? To truly empower the communities they visit to define the terms of engagement?
that's the fundamental question, I think. If those cultural dynamics of STM are really recognized, and there's a genuine commitment to reshaping them through real partnership, through listening, through a deeper understanding of cultural change, then these trips might have a chance to produce much more substantive, lasting, and mutually beneficial effects.
Okay, wow. Let's try and recap the key threads here. We've journeyed from understanding STM as a common practice, especially in U.S. evangelicalism,
Right.
to seeing the long-standing questions about its value, moving towards this focus on reform rather than outright rejection. But then realizing that just improving individual training, while helpful, probably isn't enough.
Yeah, the critique goes deeper to the structures, the power imbalances.
Exactly. Which leads to this call for much greater mutuality, real listening, and crucially, empowering local leaders, shifting control.
It's a move away from a model of primarily doing towards one of learning with and simply being alongside.
So for you, listening to this deep dive, as you encounter these discussions, or maybe even consider participating in STM yourself, we hope these perspectives give you food for thought.
Yeah, think about those power dynamics. Ask about the narratives being used. Whose voices are shaping the agenda? Are local leaders truly driving the engagement?
And maybe we can leave you with this final thought to mull over.
What if the most genuinely impactful mission trip involved far more listening than doing, significantly more being present than building something? How would that shift, that fundamental reorientation, change how we even think about cross-cultural engagement in the first place?
Something to reflect on, definitely, as you continue exploring ethical and meaningful ways to connect in our complex, interconnected world.